War movies often lie about the sky. They fake the controls, exaggerate the turns, and ignore the silent terror of sitting inside a metal shell thousands of feet above death. But a rare group of films did the opposite. They slowed down. They listened to the cockpit. They showed switches, fuel gauges, breathing panic and discipline. These are the air war films that shocked real pilots because they finally got it right. Number 15, Wings, 1927. Before green screens, before safety rigs, and before aviation myths hardened into cliches, Wings placed its cameras where no film dared. Inside real aircraft in real flight. Pilots watching today still struggle to believe what they are seeing because nothing is simulated. The control inputs are authentic. The wind resistance is real. The physical strain on the pilot is visible in every movement. When the stick jerks, it jerks because the aircraft is actually fighting the air. What makes Wings so shocking to modern aviators is not just its danger, but its honesty. The cockpit is exposed. There is no soundtrack padding the fear. Every vibration is real. Every turn risks structural failure. Pilots recognize the instinctive corrections, the way hands tighten on controls when turbulence hits, and how pilots glance repeatedly at the horizon because losing it means death. This is not choreography. This is survival caught on film. Modern air war films use technology to imitate realism. Wings achieved it through courage and recklessness. Pilots today describe it as uncomfortable to watch because they know how little margin those pilots had. There were no second takes, no digital fixes, just human beings trusting wood wire and instinct. That truth still lands harder than any modern spectacle. Number 14, 12 O'Clock High, 1949. Bomber pilots often say, this film understands command stress better than any movie before or since. 12 O'Clock High is not about dogfights. It is about pressure inside a cockpit filled with responsibility. The cramped bomber environment, the intercom discipline, and the constant procedural checks feel painfully familiar to those who flew heavy aircraft. Pilots praise how the film shows leadership breaking down inside the cockpit. Decisions are slow and deliberate because mistakes multiply across an entire formation. The cockpit is not a place of heroics, but of weight. Every order carries consequences. The film shows realistic checklist discipline, oxygen management, and radio brevity that pilots instantly recognize as authentic. What truly shocks aviators is how accurately the film portrays mental fatigue. Long missions strip confidence. The cockpit becomes a psychological battlefield where command authority erodes under fear and repetition. Pilots say this film captures the silence between commands better than action-heavy films ever could. It respects the reality that air war is often quiet until it suddenly is not. Number 13, The Blue Max, 1966. World War I aviation is often romanticized. The Blue Max destroys that illusion from inside the cockpit. Pilots praise the film for showing how primitive aircraft demanded constant control input. There is no stable flight, no autopilot. The pilot never stops working. Open cockpits expose pilots to wind vibration, engine fumes, and cold. The film shows how engine management becomes survival. Throttle misuse means flameout. Structural stress means collapse. Pilots watching recognize how fragile these machines were and how much physical strength flying demanded. What shocks modern aviators is the realism of energy management. Turns bleed speed rapidly. Climbing too aggressively kills performance. The film respects physics. Pilots note how aerial victories feel messy, chaotic, and disorienting rather than cinematic. The cockpit framing keeps the pilot trapped inside the machine, never letting the audience forget the danger. Number 12, The Battle of Britain, 1969. Many pilots consider this the most honest, large-scale air war film ever made because it respects procedure above spectacle. The cockpit scenes are quiet, disciplined, and restrained. Throttle movements are subtle. Radio chatter is clipped and functional. There is no excess drama because real pilots do not waste oxygen on panic. What shocks aviators is how accurately the film portrays formation flying. Staying in position is shown as exhausting and mentally draining. Small errors cascade into disaster. Pilots recognize the constant scanning of instruments and horizon while tracking friendly aircraft at the edge of vision. The cockpit becomes a cage of responsibility where one mistake risks collision or loss of formation integrity. The film also earns respect for showing fuel anxiety. Pilots note how often characters check gauges and calculate return margins. There is no heroic last-second miracle. Running out of fuel means death. The cockpit framing reinforces this reality by keeping pilots confined inside their aircraft rather than glorifying external combat. For many real pilots, this film feels less like entertainment and more like a memory. Number 11. Memphis Belle, 1990. Bomber crews consistently praise Memphis Belle for capturing how crowded and chaotic a heavy bomber cockpit truly is. Every crew station matters. Oxygen hoses tangle. Intercom discipline becomes survival. Pilots recognize the constant background noise that never stops and never allows rest. What shocks real aviators is how accurately the film shows damage management. Systems fail gradually, not explosively. Crews respond with procedure, not panic. Pilots note the believable way aircraft handling degrades as damage accumulates. Control surfaces feel heavy. Trim becomes unpredictable. The cockpit turns into a problem-solving environment under extreme stress. The film also earns praise for portraying crew hierarchy correctly. Decisions flow through command channels. No one acts alone. Pilots watching see the same coordination required to keep a wounded aircraft flying. The cockpit is not heroic. It is work. Hard-focused, exhausting work that demands trust between crew members who know one mistake ends everyone. Number 10. Flight of the Intruder, 1991. Attack pilots were stunned by how much this film understands workload. Low-level attack flying leaves no margin for error. The cockpit is busy, constantly demanding attention. Navigation weapon systems and terrain awareness compete for focus. Pilots praise how the film shows task saturation without exaggeration. What shocks aviators is the realism of crew coordination. Pilot and bombardier navigator work as a single unit. Communication is concise and functional. There is no dramatic yelling. Every call-out has purpose. Pilots recognize how silence becomes as important as speech when workload peaks. The film also earns respect for showing the moral weight of missions. Cockpit scenes emphasize decision-making under rules of engagement. Pilots are not free to improvise heroics. They operate inside constraints that can feel suffocating. Real pilots say this film captures the mental tension of knowing you can fly perfectly and still lose. The cockpit becomes a place of calculation rather than glory. Number 9. Dunkirk, 2017. Real pilots were stunned by how little this film explains and how much it expects the viewer to understand through behavior alone. Dunkirk does not narrate its cockpit logic. It shows it. Fuel checks are constant. Glances toward the gauge carry dread. Silence dominates because pilots do not talk when thinking. What shocks aviators most is the spatial awareness. The cockpit framing limits vision exactly as real fighters do. Pilots must lean shift and guess. Situational awareness comes from instinct, not information. The film respects that reality. Dogfights feel brief, disorienting, and incomplete. Pilots never see the whole picture, only fragments. The handling feels authentic because the aircraft are treated as machines with limits. Turns bleed energy. Climbing costs fuel. Pilots note how control inputs look restrained rather than aggressive. This is not ballet. It is calculation under pressure. The cockpit becomes a narrowing tunnel where every second matters and mistakes cannot be reversed. Number 8. The Right Stuff, 1983. Test pilots consistently praise this film for understanding cockpit discipline. The Right Stuff treats flight as procedure rather than bravado. Switches are flipped with purpose. Call-outs are deliberate. Silence is respected. Pilots watching recognize the rhythm of checklists and the mental separation required to survive dangerous flight regimes. What shocks aviators is the accuracy of risk portrayal. The cockpit is not portrayed as a place of confidence, but of uncertainty. Pilots are aware that systems may fail without warning. The film captures how pilots compartmentalize fear to function. Hands move even when the mind hesitates. The film also earns admiration for showing how aircraft communicate danger through vibration, sound, and resistance. Pilots read the machine through touch, not dialogue. The cockpit becomes a living instrument panel that speaks through feedback. Real pilots say this film understands that flying is a conversation between human and machine, and that conversation can turn hostile without notice. Number 7. Dark Blue World, 2001. Pilots often describe this film as emotionally authentic because it respects cockpit routine as emotional grounding. Dark Blue World shows pilots clinging to procedure to survive chaos. The cockpit becomes a familiar refuge amid loss and fear. That detail resonates deeply with aviators. What shocks pilots is how naturally the film portrays transitions between calm and terror. One moment, the cockpit is quiet. The next, it is chaos. There is no buildup. That sudden shift feels real. Pilots note the believable way characters freeze briefly, then act because hesitation is human but fatal. The cockpit layouts feel accurate and lived in. Switches are handled correctly. Instrument scans feel habitual. Pilots recognize the posture, breathing, and hand movements that come from training rather than acting. The film does not glorify flight. It shows it as exhausting, repetitive, and psychologically demanding. That honesty is why pilots trust it. Number 6. The Bridges at Toko-Ri, 1954. Naval aviators often describe this film as quietly devastating because it treats the cockpit as a place of duty rather than desire. The Bridges at Toko-Ri strips carrier aviation of glamour and replaces it with obligation. Pilots are not chasing victory. They are completing a task they understand may already be paid for in advance. What shocks real pilots is how accurately the film captures carrier workload. Launches and recoveries are not routine moments but calculated risks. Deck motion, wind angle, fuel margins, and timing dominate attention. Aviators recognize the tension of committing to a launch knowing divert options are few and recovery windows are unforgiving. The cockpit becomes a narrowing equation rather than an escape. Low-level attack flying is portrayed with restraint. Aircraft feel heavy and constrained. Turns are conservative because energy loss is dangerous. Pilots note the realism of hesitation before attack runs. Once committed, there is no room to correct. The cockpit framing reinforces this by boxing pilots in with instruments, canopy frames, and terrain. Most unsettling is the calm. Radios stay clipped, hands stay steady. Not because fear is absent, but because procedure suppresses it. Pilots recognize this immediately. Sometimes everything is done right. Sometimes that still isn't enough. The cockpit offers no fairness, only responsibility. Number 5. Top Gun, 1986. Fighter pilots often smile when discussing this film, but many also admit it gets more right than critics allow. Beneath the bravado and music lies surprisingly accurate cockpit behavior. Switch movements follow real logic. Radio calls mirror real brevity codes. The pacing of engagements reflects actual air combat maneuvering rather than pure spectacle. What shocks pilots is how the film captures the psychological environment of the cockpit. Confidence masks fear. Aggression hides doubt. Pilots recognize the internal monologue that never reaches the radio. The cockpit becomes a place where ego and discipline collide constantly. That tension feels authentic to those who have flown fighters. The film also respects aircraft limitations more than remembered. Turns are not infinite. Energy loss matters. Pilots note how mistakes result in positional disadvantage rather than miraculous recovery. The cockpit framing keeps pilots focused forward, reinforcing tunnel vision under stress. While the film exaggerates personalities, it treats flying itself with respect. Real pilots acknowledge that beneath the style lies a genuine understanding of cockpit workload and tactical pressure. That combination is why the film continues to resonate within aviation culture long after the soundtrack fades. Number 4. Aces High, 1976. Pilots often describe Aces High as brutally honest because it refuses to treat flying as heroic performance. This film understands that the cockpit is not a stage. It is a workplace where exhaustion, fear, and physics quietly grind people down. World War I aircraft are shown as unstable, unforgiving machines that demand constant attention just to stay alive. What shocks aviators is how accurately the film portrays workload. There is no stable flight. Pilots are always correcting. Stick pressure, rudder input, throttle adjustments. Open cockpits amplify wind, vibration, and noise. Pilots watching recognize the physical strain of fighting the aircraft while also fighting fear. Flying is shown as labor, not freedom. Combat scenes avoid choreography. Engagements are brief, confused, and often inconclusive. Pilots lose sight of enemies quickly. Situational awareness is fragile. Victories feel accidental rather than triumphant. This matches real pilot accounts where survival mattered more than scoring kills. The cockpit framing keeps the audience trapped with the pilot. There is no omniscient view, only partial information and shrinking options. Most unsettling is the emotional numbness that sets in. Pilots follow procedure not because it guarantees success, but because it is the only defense against panic. Aces High earns pilot respect because it shows the truth many films avoid. Flying does not make war noble. It simply makes consequences arrive faster. Number 3, Devotion, 2022. Real pilots were surprised by how restrained this film is inside the cockpit. Devotion does not rush its flying scenes. It allows procedures to unfold naturally, and that patience is exactly what pilots recognize as authentic. Pre-flight checks are not rushed. Taxi feels deliberate. Takeoff carries weight because the aircraft feels heavy and vulnerable rather than heroic. What shocks aviators most is how accurately the film portrays early jet-era workload. These aircraft demand constant attention. There is no automation to lean on. Pilots must manage speed, altitude, and engine behavior simultaneously while remaining aware of formation position. The cockpit becomes a balancing act where every correction creates a new problem. Pilots watching recognize the posture and focus required to survive that environment. The film also earns respect for its handling of radio discipline. Communication is minimal and precise. There is no unnecessary chatter. Pilots understand that silence often means everything is under control, while noise signals trouble. The cockpit scenes reflect that truth. Perhaps the most powerful element is how the film shows trust between pilots without dialogue. Wingmen watch each other constantly. Small movements signal intent. Pilots recognize this silent language because it is learned through shared danger, not conversation. The cockpit becomes a space where loyalty is measured in positioning rather than words. That detail resonates deeply with real aviators who know that survival often depends on someone else reading your aircraft as well as you do. Number 2. The Dam Busters, 1955. Pilots often describe this film as unsettling because it understands how precision flying feels when there is no margin left. The Dam Busters treats the cockpit as a place ruled by numbers, timing, and discipline rather than courage. Every movement is deliberate because every mistake is final. What shocks aviators most is the portrayal of low-level flight stress. Holding exact altitude at night is shown as constant labor, not smooth flight. The aircraft never settles. Pilots recognize the micro-corrections, small stick inputs, throttle nudges, constant visual checks that define real low-level operations. The film never suggests stability. It shows flight as continuous control. Cockpit communication is sparse and procedural. Call-outs exist only to confirm parameters. Silence dominates because attention is consumed by instruments, references, and countdowns. Pilots watching recognize this instantly. When workload peaks, speech disappears. Fuel, timing, and geometry are treated as hard constraints, not dramatic devices. Once the aircraft commits, there is no improvisation left. Pilots respect how the film shows commitment points where turning back is no longer an option. After that, the cockpit becomes a tunnel. For aviators, the Dam Busters is uncomfortable because it reflects how missions actually work. Not heroic, not emotional. Just rigid execution inside a fragile machine where discipline is the only protection left. Number 1. Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, 2003. Pilots frequently rank this film at the top of realism lists despite it not being an aviation movie because it understands cockpit psychology better than most air war films ever made. Aviators recognize the environment immediately. Confined space, limited information, absolute responsibility. What shocks pilots is how accurately the film portrays command under uncertainty. Decisions are made with fragments, sounds, delayed reports, vibrations, incomplete visuals. This mirrors combat flying, where pilots rarely see the full picture. The cockpit becomes a place of inference, not clarity. Silence is treated as operational space, not absence. Orders are brief. Movements are economical. Pilots recognize this culture because unnecessary noise interferes with judgment. Tension builds through waiting, listening, and calculating rather than action. Fatigue accumulates quietly. Command isolates the leader emotionally. Pilots watching recognize how responsibility narrows perception and removes comfort. Once decisions are made, doubt must be suppressed until survival allows it. Most importantly, the film understands discipline as survival. Procedure replaces instinct, preparation replaces improvisation. Aviators often say this is one of the few war films that truly captures what it feels like to command a fragile machine while knowing lives depend on decisions made without certainty. That understanding is pure cockpit truth, and that is why pilots trust this film completely. These films endure because they respect the cockpit as a place where procedure replaces bravado and physics punishes mistakes instantly. Real pilots recognize them because they reflect lived experience rather than fantasy. In the air, truth matters more than spectacle, and these films never forget that. These films endure because they respect the cockpit as a place where procedure replaces bravado and physics punishes mistakes instantly. Real pilots recognize them because they reflect lived experience rather than fantasy. In the air, truth matters more than spectacle, and these films never forget that.